is Monica Perez here with the 11th and final installment. I believe it's the 11th, maybe it's the 12th. Well, it is the final installment of The Octopus, Secret Government and the Death of Danny Casolaro. We're reading it, we're talking about it. It is in case you want to get a copy of it yourself. If you go back to the first episode, I pointed out I spent maybe $50 on this, and I knew it would go up in value. I think it was 500 the next time. I think came back down to 300. But if you want this version, it's the revised edition by Ken Thomas and Jim Keith. In the last episode, we talked about one of the chapters, one of the kind of epilogue type chapters was about Jim Keith and his untimely death. He died in, I believe it was 1999. So he was a great conspiracy researcher pre-internet. He wrote in magazines and online magazines eventually, but he was just old school typewriter journalist, I think, and he was not around to see 9/11, or he probably would have pegged it right away. He was really good at that. So we are about to read chapter 23, September 11th, epilogue. So obviously it's just by Ken Thomas because Jim Keith was dead by then. In the last episode, I mentioned the local news coverage of the death of an investigator called David McGowan, not the known conspiracy researcher David McGowan, but a great person, I think, anyway, a person of integrity, who was, I think his death was framed as a murder-suicide with his family, and I just don't believe that for a second. So I'm not sure if it's in the show notes yet. I'll actually put it in the description of this YouTube video as soon as it's finished. And we also have a playlist of this entire series of this book, The Octopus. And then the next book is going to be another Jim Keith book about MK Ultra. All right, let's hit it. So September 11th, epilogue. Ever expanding and morphing into new, more sinister applications, the Promise software remains a thing of legend and fact. Legend has it that the Echelon satellite system, are you aware of the Echelon, the 5 eyes? I believe it's South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, the US, and Canada, I guess. I mean, or maybe the UK is folded in there, but it's basically the English-speaking countries. And I always think of it as kind of literal, like LITTORAL, the seafaring empire, the British Empire and their English-speaking colonies, as opposed to that massive Eurasian landmass. And that's the Echelon countries, I believe, which can photograph their satellite system. The Echelon satellite system can photograph automobile license plates from outer space. Yeah, this guy's writing this 20 years ago, so he's amazed at that. Can you imagine what they're up to now? It utilizes some mutations of Promise extrapolation capabilities to fill in the visual contents of those long-distance photos. Fact has it that the coming smart card, a credit card sized surveillance tool that can hold over 5 gigabytes of information on its holder, I guess that means a chip, has been pioneered in the Hong Kong transit system under the name, you're not going to believe this, under the name the Octopus card. Fact and legend about Promise came together after the world-changing disasters that occurred on September 11th, 2001. An Irish nationalist known as MacGuffin gave an unsourced report that Osama bin Laden avoided capture by the U.S. military in the months after the World Trade Tower and Pentagon crashes by using Promise. He asserted that the FBI turncoat Robert Hansen passed the version of Promise used by British and German intelligence onto Russia, where it proceeded to find itself in the hands of the notorious chief Arab terrorist. Okay, this is just an aside. I haven't read this chapter yet, or if I did, it was a very long time ago. So if Ken Thomas, actually, though, I will say in his defense, this was written in 2004. I did not know the truth about 9/11 until 2013, until the Boston Marathon bombing changed my opinion from they wouldn't to, oh, yes, they would. So I'm going to give him a pass. But this might be torture if he doesn't really know what happened. This is 2004, remember. The Justice Department reporter for the Washington Times picked up the story and concluded the sophisticated software gives bin Laden access to databases on specific targets of his choosing and the ability to monitor electronic banking transactions, easing money laundering operations for himself or others. The Justice Department's complaint against Hansen charged that he made extensive use of FOIMS, Field Office Information Management Systems, and COIN, Community Online Intelligence Systems, and SCMODs, State, County, Municipal Database System. No, I'm just kidding. Not SCMODs. That's from the Blues Brothers. Two of the FBI's known case management software systems, FOIMS and COIN. The Times quotes sources as saying FOIMS and COINs are believed to be upgraded versions of the promised software program. McGuffin, not McLovin, but McGuffin, claimed that INSTALL's Bill Hamilton told him that Osama bin Laden paid the Russians $2 million for an upgraded version of the software called Enhanced Promise. The Times quotes Hamilton as having no specific information about Hansen, but suggested that a technical manual given by Hansen to the Russians, according to the FBI, was related to the use of Promise as the standard software of the U.S. intelligence community. McGuffin argued that Hansen, before his arrest, had played an important role in installing Promise in MI5, MI6, and Germany's BND. I don't know. I don't know what to think about all this. There probably is some angle that is a part of the big picture. I don't know. Michael Riconosciuto himself claimed to have met bin Laden in the spring of 1986 while networking with representatives of the anti-Soviet Mujahideen. Danger Man proposed to sell shoulder-held missile launchers called man-pads or man-portable air defense systems. Yes, that is dangerous. For use against Soviet helicopters. According to the story, bin Laden at the time traveled under the name Tim Osman, a pseudonym supplied by the CIA for his tour of the U.S. and U.S. military bases in search of political support and armaments. Okay, yeah, because bin Laden was our man in the Mujahideen, whatever, to undermine the Soviets in Afghanistan, was an asset. And yeah, I mean, why not give him Promise in order to make this thing happen? But I don't think he had anything really to do with it. So that's why I'm a little confused. Okay, apparently the meeting ended when Riconosciuto explained that his faction of intelligence world connections did not think bin Laden represented the true Mujahideen. The story ended with another plea to release Riconosciuto from his current prison residence in Springfield, Missouri. If the war against Osama bin Laden or Tim Osman is not a total fraud, then what is Michael Riconosciuto doing in prison? Why doesn't he have an office next to Colin Powell so he can give realistic advice on bin Laden's thinking? I just want to see who wrote that. Whose plea was that? This was in Laissez-Faire City Times from November 12th, 2001. Orlin Grab. Grab's website is orlingrab.com. He gives Michael Riconosciuto's current address as the prison. Yeah, so I don't know who that is. Another writer-editor team, Tom Flacco and Michael Ruppert, made the case for the use of Promise in the insider trading deals that preceded the September 11th tragedies. They received a non-denial from CIA spokesperson Tom Crispell that the CIA had been using Promise beyond American borders to scrutinize world financial markets for national security purposes, and one from the FBI claiming that the FBI has discontinued use of the Promise software. That means nothing. Flacco notes that the latter denial followed almost 17 years of denial by the FBI and the Department of Justice in court and under oath that they used the software at all. Nevertheless, Ruppert and Flacco maintained the stock screening and short selling that came in the days before the plane crashes were accomplished with Promise, as was the financial tracking of bin Laden's assets that happened in the aftermath. Research tributaries leading to promise keep alive Casolaro's sense of history and parapolitics and his foreboding about the developing world of perpetual surveillance and war. Despite the push to transform the tragedies of September 11th into simple-minded, war-hungry patriotism, and whether or not promise has ever proven to be a part of the manipulations, many Americans more readily accept the notion that Osama bin Laden came to power under Octopus-like funding. Plans to strengthen U.S. military power in Afghanistan, where U.S. retaliation for 9/11 was felt first, began as early as 1990 when oil was struck in the eastern part of the Caspian Sea in Kazakhstan. The democracy warping results of the American presidential election in 2000 returned to power the same crew of secret government cronies that Casolaro had tracked through Iran-Contra and on back to drug traffic in the Golden Triangle of Southeast Asia. The anti-terror war seems more about building a pipeline to the Caspian, exploiting the opium crop in Afghanistan, and expanding the weapons trade than about protecting America from terrorists. Well, he didn't get that wrong. I mean, he's absolutely right about all of that. Let's see if there are any juicy footprints until we get to the appendix, which should be interesting because it's an interview with William and Nancy Hamilton, who were still kicking around, that's for sure. One is the Octopus cards back in business, 1998. This is a Jacqueline Mayo article. About 4 million Octopus cards had been issued for Hong Kong's mass transit railway corporations by the transport consortium Creative Star. The supply was exhausted, and the consortium at the time planned to order 3 million more. It planned another increase of 7 million the following year, and that's a small growth pattern. Because the Octopus card uses proprietary technology. Some part of your physical presence is on the card, and new ways of using the cards are being initiated. They keep pushing back this real ID thing. You're supposed to get a real ID by, I think it's now 2025. Otherwise, you have to travel with your passport. But I've been traveling with my passport for 25 years. I never travel without it because back in the day when I first got married, and my name is Monica Perez, I got stopped and missed planes all the time. They acted like I was missing the planes by accident, but they were actually keeping me off the planes because I believe it was a Mexican drug dealer with a similar but not same birth date as me, and obviously the same name, was a wanted person. And one of the security guys said, if you have another name to travel on. So I always travel with my passport because it's in my maiden name. It's not that hard. And according to the current plan, I will not need a real ID. All righty. Let's just read this one. John Judge expressed a cautionary note about all of this. Well, it seems bin Laden has lots of talents and lots of time on his hands. What the hell would it take to monitor all that information from all those agencies? On the other hand, if bin Laden is their creature, perhaps one agency lets him know what another is doing against him. Sounds more like an elaborate cover to explain why we have not caught him, or will not. Hansen is a double agent case, I think, planted to feed disinformation into the Soviet hands. His links to Opus Dei and COINTELPRO make me think he was really a very clever plant. Wow, I never heard that one before. Hansen was like a triple agent. Maybe. So I'd be cautious with any conclusions. Perhaps he did install something that would allow U.S. intelligence to track bin Laden. That would make sense. Okay. That was on September 21st, 2001. So I don't know who John Judge is, but he certainly seems to be ahead of this. The issue returned again with the June 2003 resignation of Paul Redmond, the Assistant Secretary for Information Analysis for the Homeland Security Department, which was only created in the wake of 9/11. Described by some as a legendary spy catcher, he had a role in the capture of Aldrich Ames. Redmond resigned for, quote, health reasons. Most took that as polite cover for Redmond's frustration with underfunding of the department. But others connected it to a rumored secret investigation Redmond was conducting into Hansen's role in delivering promise to Osama. According to this rumor, Redmond had discovered shockingly long-standing common interests between the Bush and bin Laden families and was forced to resign. Of course, you recall that the bin Laden family was the only one on a plane the day after 9/11. I was on one of the first planes that flew out because I was some kind of platinum status because I had traveled a lot when I was working. And I was on, I mean, we were waiting for hours and hours. I've told people about this. It was crazy. They were on the plane the day before, I believe a private plane. Let's see. Promise, in fact, also had been given to Saddam Hussein by the senior Bush in the early 1990s. Oh, they were allies for sure. Casolaro reported that Iraq was one of the countries that purchased the software illegally. Although the story provided an opportunity for Inslaw's story to be discussed anew in various opinion and editorial pieces, it seemed to trace to a single source. What else? All right, this is the very last. Okay, so the last little footnote I have here, the last footnote of the whole book, is something about this is the footnote that appears after the anti-terror war seems more about building pipelines through the Caspian, exploiting the opium crop of Afghanistan, and expanding the weapons trade than about protecting America. Okay, this is the footnote that goes with that sentence. Even as the war moved into the Philippines, echoes were heard of Casolaro's cross connections between the domestic and foreign in the global strategy of tension. Adam Parfrey gave the most detailed and succinct report. I think that strategy of tension is still going strong. I'm seeing it in the Son of Sam books that I'm reading. I'm seeing it in the school shooting stuff. It's everywhere. Having these kids be terrorized night and day, first by nuclear war when I was growing up, and then here, it seems like a pattern. The ACLU works tirelessly on behalf of Abraham Ahmed, who the legal organization claimed was a victim of racist profiling. On the same day as bombing, Ahmed attempted to fly from Oklahoma City to Amman, Jordan, but was stopped at Heathrow after American Airlines flight security notified the FBI of the Middle Easterner's suspicious behavior. Ahmed was cuffed and returned to the U.S. after his luggage was found to contain such things as 2 car radios, the sort used to bomb Pan Am 103. What was this guy, a CIA agent? Silicon, solder, shielded and unshielded wire, a timing device, a photo album with pictures of weapons and missile, and a blue jogging suit similar to that seen worn by an Arab suspect in front of the Murrah building on the morning of the blast. Remember, they were going to pin that on Arabs. Remember. Then that's what the Governor's Brothers book was about, the exact same scenario, but Arabs did it. Perhaps prompted by ACLU's media tirade, the FBI promptly released suspect Abraham Ahmed, and President Clinton apologized to the Arab American community. Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols had continual contacts with known terrorist entities up to the day of the Murrah building blast. Nichols was married to a Filipino woman and took trips to Cebu City, Philippines, without his wife in late 92 and early 93 to meet with such friendly folk from the Abu Sayyaf terrorist org as Ramzi Youssef, Abdul Hakim Murad, Wali Khan Amin Shah, and several others. Ramzi Youssef. And several others to discuss the bombing of the OKC building. Murad was arrested in 1995 for the initial World Trade Center bombing. Remember that? And after viewing the Oklahoma City bombing on a New York jail television set, he remarked to a guard that the Liberation Army of the Philippines, a group connected to Abu Sayyaf, was responsible for the blast. Later, Abu Sayyaf leader Edwin Angeles corrected Murad for the record. It was the Palestine Liberation Army and the Islamic Jihad, which Murad was referring to. This army is associated with Hamas and is based in Lebanon. After the Oklahoma City bombing, Saudi intelligence told the FBI that Iraq had hired Pakistanis to do the Murrah building job. Edwin Angeles is a Pakistani. The Parfrey Adam, the Oklahoma City bombing jihad from October 10th, 2001. Well, that was written after Jim Keith died. And Jim Keith had written, I would say, the first kind of real valid expose of the Oklahoma City bomb conspiracy and cover up. So I'll have to reread that. I mean, it's not complete because it was written in 1996 before the true nature of the octopus was fully known, even to these guys, Casolaro, etc. All right. Appendix 1. So that's Bill and Nancy Hamilton kind of now. Well, not now, 20 years ago now. So they must be really old now. But I believe they're still around. All right. The following interview with Bill and Nancy Hamilton was conducted by Ken Thomas at the INSTALL office in Washington, D.C. on June 8th, 1995. Okay. How did you first get in contact with Danny? Bill, you should contact Terry Miller, president of Government Sales Consultants, which provides advice to companies that sell computer-related products to the United States government. He worked with Danny Casolaro at Computer Age Publications. That's right, Bill answers. He was an old friend of Danny's. In August of 1990, he talked to Danny and suggested that he look into investigating this thing. Oh, again, that's the month that Danny contacted us. He contacted us when we were on vacation at the beach in Delaware. He wanted to come down and see us at the beach, which was not convenient for us, so it didn't happen. But that began our conversations with him. That lasted for a year until he died in August 1991. So he only talked to the Hamiltons for 1 year. Question, do you know anything at all about his relationship with Computer Age at the time? Bill, he owned it. Was he in the process of selling it? Bill, he had already sold it. I don't know how many months before this. Did he talk about it at all? He talked about it. Was he disappointed in the terms of the sale? I don't know. That's his private business. I worked with him mostly on the investigation of the Justice Department. He was not a person who exhibited much interest in financial matters. I don't ever recall much of a conversation about terms of the sale of his newsletter. It goes to the question of whether or not he was suicidal. Some people have suggested the poor terms might have contributed to that. Bill says, that's ludicrous. That's the most ludicrous thing I have ever heard. Nancy, in the year of talking to this man, there was never any evidence that he was depressed about anything, much less that. He never mentioned that he was disappointed in that, to my knowledge. He was excited about his investigation. Bill, it was much too serious a matter. He spent a year full-time looking into malfeasance by the government, and the government has been unwilling to allow an independent investigation of his death. The malfeasance was in the Justice Department, and the Justice Department insists that only it will be the judge of whatever happened down there, and the local Martinsburg authorities, who are not the kind of places you'd think about going if you were looking for sophisticated investigative capabilities. Nancy, if anything bothered him, it was what he was finding out about the way his government worked. He was a person who found it difficult to believe that the government was capable of such skullduggery. He didn't want to believe it, just as we don't want to believe it. But when presented with facts, you have to accept it, and that is depressing. So this was in the 90s. Nancy and Bill had been fighting this fight for over 10 years by now. Question, when you first met, at what stage was the case? Bill, we had already had 3 weeks of trial in 1987, and this was 1990. We had already had 399 findings of fact already upheld by a separate opinion in the United States District Court. Nancy, it was already under investigation by the House Judiciary Committee. It had already been investigated in part by the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, which found stonewalling, blocking, and intimidation at the Justice Department. Bill, there had been an extensive public record by that time. Question, so you were kind of like the story behind the story he was pursuing? Nancy, no, we were the story. Terry Miller told him that he should get on this story. That is and was a very interesting story. He then called us to find out more about the story. He was into the INSLAW story. His investigation into INSLAW took him into other areas. And at one point, he expressed frustration that he was getting all this information on these other things connecting, he thought, to INSLAW, and was frustrated at getting the hard stuff he needed on INSLAW. Just a week before he died, he expressed to different people that he finally got the final evidence on INSLAW, the pieces that directly affected INSLAW. Man, reading an interview isn't as good as when they, no wonder they summarize this stuff. But I think it's important to have the raw information. Oh, this is these guys' words. Question, was he sharing his research on the other topics with you as he went along? Bill, he was willing to. We didn't really have time to entertain it. We're trying to operate a business here, so we had limited interest in BCCI and the rest of it. Our meetings primarily consisted of telephone conversations with him every day. Nancy, and asking questions as he went about his investigation, because as he picked up information, it would raise questions that he needed to ask us. We would answer his questions and he would proceed with his investigation. If something puzzled him about what he was told, how could this be? That was the main thing. Remember, Nancy was part of the business. She wasn't just Bill's wife. She was savvy. Question: at any point, did he say he had a contract to get published? Bill: no. He was working on one and he was optimistic. He expressed optimism about getting one. In fact, he was planning a party in the final weeks of his life. He was planning the guest list of a party to celebrate the book contract. He was planning the guest list of a party to celebrate the book contract. Does not sound suicidal. Question: as time went along, you put him in contact with Michael Riconosciuto. Bill: yes, but you have to understand how that works. We gave him lots of contacts. He'd take those contacts and get other contacts of his own. How did you know Riconosciuto? Bill: Riconosciuto called us a few months before Danny came on this case in May in 1990 and spoke to us for 2.5 hours, talking to us about the Wackenhut Cabazon joint venture, Earl Bryan, Peter Videnix, people like that. How soon was it after that talk with Riconosciuto that you had him talk to Casolaro? August, September. So what is that, May to August? We had conversation with Michael Riconosciuto in May 1990, and we didn't hear from him again until almost the end of that calendar year. Did you find Riconosciuto believable at that time? Bill: a lot of what Riconosciuto said we found hard to believe, but we attempted to find out whether or not it was true. I would say that 75% of it turned out we found corroborating evidence about it. So most of what he told us about during that first telephone conversation seems to have been true. And we talked to people he worked with at the Wackenhut Cabazon joint venture who expressed hostility toward him, disliked and disparaged him, but who corroborated most of what he said in his affidavit to us. What they did not corroborate was the part of the affidavit that is most important to Inslaw's case. And that is that the joint venture, in addition to producing fuel, air, explosives, and biological and chemical warfare weapons, night vision goggles, and machine guns, was modifying the promised software for Earl Bryan. They didn't deny it. They said they didn't know about it. Over time, they have admitted, these former colleagues who don't like Riconosciuto, that there was an NSA project on the Wackenhut Cabazon joint venture and that it's extremely highly classified. More highly classified than any other projects, and no one has ever explained what that project was. So these people were hostile to Riconosciuto, but they were actually saying the same thing. Bill: they're not admitting promise, but they are admitting that a colonel from NSA flew out to the Cabazon reservation one day and chewed out some FBI agents who were investigating the homicides of the vice chairman of the tribe and a couple of other guys, Alvarez and a few other guys, and told them to keep their noses out of the NSA project, and that Riconosciuto was involved in the NSA project. So it seems likely to me that what they're doing and expressing some healthy fear about violating espionage laws by affirming some of the stuff that Riconosciuto was saying about the NSA project. I think the NSA project is very likely the Promise Project. I can't believe Riconosciuto is still alive. I mean, he might not still be alive, but as of this writing, he was still alive. Over time, Casolaro became more and more skeptical of Riconosciuto because, in addition to everything that could be verified about what he said some pretty wild stuff after a while. Bill: I wouldn't characterize it that way. He was disappointed when he went out to see him in jail after he was arrested. He was not able to get a copy of what Riconosciuto claimed to have, which was a tape recording of Peter Videnix threatening him. Whether that existed or not, I have no way of knowing. But a lot of the things that Riconosciuto talks about that are extreme sounding are things involving the United States intelligence agencies. And most of that stuff is probably true. U.S. intelligence agencies use people like Riconosciuto. Nancy: that is very clear from what we have learned over all these years. They hire people like Riconosciuto, and they are the first to say that if you bring Riconosciuto in, look at him. You can't trust anything he says. But in the Noriega trial, the government brought in just such witnesses. But we think what happens, from what we've learned, the government hires these people. They do things for the government that normally American citizens wouldn't do. And then they do some things for themselves that normal American citizens don't do. And the government can't say anything about it because they're their boys. That makes sense. That makes sense. It's kind of like psycho soldiers or whatever. Interesting. And you might, knowing that crowd, breed people for the choice. They're for the job. They breed super soldiers, don't they? Why not breed super brains? Maybe some people think that's why they're intentionally creating a pool of people who have autism or, imbalanced abilities. Let me bring up Robert Booth Nichols' name. Would he fall into that category? Nancy, of having worked with the government? Yeah. Bill? Yeah. Now you introduce Nichols to Casolaro as well, right? Yeah. Could you go over exactly how that happened? Bill, we contacted some reporters to see if they ever heard of Riconosciuto, West Coast reporters. And Nichols had been interviewed by people who contacted him on the savings and loan matter. He talked to us a little bit about the savings and loan matter first time. That's why we contacted Mary Fricker and Steve Pizzo, who did this book called Inside Job. We should check that out. Check it out with Steve Brule. I have to write this stuff down, man. World moves pretty fast these days. Okay. The looting of America's savings and loans. That sounds like the subtitle of that, because Nancy adds, so it sounds like Inside Job, the looting of America's savings and loans, by Steve Pizzo and maybe Mary Fricker. Bill, we got a phone call from Michael Riconosciuto, and a small part of what he told us had to do with savings and loans. It sounded like he knew a lot about the bilking of the savings and loans too. Did they ever encounter him? Yeah, the savings and loan thing was an inside job. That definitely was. They had interviewed him, and they had also interviewed at least one or two other people that had worked on the Wackenhut Cabazon joint venture. They introduced us to Peter Zukoski, and we interviewed him, and he introduced us to Bob Nichols. We talked to Nichols. Nichols and Zukoski both have a low opinion of Riconosciuto, but both verified everything he said in his affidavit, except the promise stuff. That's a limited hangout. We talked a number of times with Nichols and met with him on a couple of occasions, once here in Washington, once in California when we were out there for some other reason. And he met with Danny here, and Danny talked to him quite a bit. He's more presentable than Riconosciuto in the sense of looking more middle class and bright, as is Riconosciuto. What he really is, I'm not sure. He obviously has had extensive dealings with intelligence agencies, both in our country and probably in other countries. Yeah, Nichols is definitely a spooky dude. Question, so what was his relationship with Casolaro like? Bill, he talked a lot to Casolaro. Question, did it grow along the same lines as the one with Riconosciuto? Did he accept everything he said? Nancy, he did not accept. Bill, that predicate is wrong. Casolaro did not accept everything that anyone, Nancy said. Bill, anything that anyone, it goes like this. Bill and Nancy are chiming in together. That predicate is wrong. Casolaro did not accept everything that anyone, Riconosciuto, anyone said, that I said or that Nichols said. What Casolaro believed about Nichols and Riconosciuto at the end, I don't know. I talked to Danny every day, sometimes several times a day. I was intensely involved with him, but I couldn't tell you about, at the end of his life, what he thought about those two guys. At various times, he thought Nichols had been part of his octopus and had broken away from it, but I'm not at all sure that he still thought he had broken away from it at the end. I'm just not clear. He had a lot of misgivings about both of them. He found them both useful. They told him things that you won't get from the Justice Department about the Justice Department. He never took anything at face value. Question, is it too far afield not to talk a little bit about Promise and when it was first developed? Bill, that's already documented. We can give you some documents on the history. Let me ask you about the current status of the case. Is there an appeal left? No, we're back in court. Back in court? The U.S. Congress, the Senate, passed a unanimous congressional reference sending the INSTALL case over to the government courts. Are you familiar with the fact that Webster Hubbell reopened the investigation? Bill, he was appointed by Janet Reno to look into the responses to the Bois report, which was commissioned by her predecessor but released by Reno herself. So we dealt with Hubbell. Didn't Bois essentially close the investigation? Bill, Bois was appointed by Bill Barr. In December of 1992, Barr recused himself of INSLAW because he was going back to his old law firm, which in the meantime had been representing Earl Bryan in the INSLAW case. Even that was a little too much for a person like Barr, I guess. It didn't look too nice. By the way, Barr recused himself. I remember reading about that, I think in an Epstein case too. And I'm not sure he went back for any reason other than to have an excuse to recuse. Anyway, I'd have to investigate that more. So Bois supposedly didn't submit the report to Barr, and then there was an interregnum between Barr's departure and the beginning of the Democrat confirmed as Attorney General. During that interregnum, I guess it means between the reigns, because it's interregnum, REGNUM, there was a Republican holdover of the Attorney General, Stuart Gerson. Bill, why Bois didn't submit it to Gerson is hard to explain. He supposedly submitted, I don't necessarily believe any of this stuff, but he supposedly submitted it to Reno when Reno was confirmed. Gerson was the Attorney General under Clinton for the first few months because Clinton couldn't find any Attorney General that could be confirmed. I remember I believe I was in law school at the time, and they had asked several of the law professors at my school, and people said no. They turned it down, and they asked a classmate of mine, his father, they asked him to be Treasury Secretary, I believe, and he turned him down. The people did not want to have anything to do with Clinton. Clinton couldn't find it. Yeah, Gerson was the acting Attorney General, but Hubbell was really running the department. Question, what happened to Hubbell's investigation? Bill, he didn't do an investigation. Hubbell did a whitewash. He just dropped it? No. He pretended to do an investigation, focusing on the Danny Casolaro aspects. We did a very detailed rebuttal of the Bois report a month after Reno released it and submitted it for rebuttal a month after Reno. And Hubbell went to the House and Senate Judiciary Committees. Then we met with Hubbell a few months later in the fall of 1993, October specifically. That was the first and only time. The rebuttal is striking in its disrobing of the Bois report. The Bois report is flimsy on its own terms, unconvincing. It contradicts the fully litigated findings of fact of 2 sitting federal judges, and it contradicts the investigative findings of a major committee of Congress. Just flatly contradicts all of that. So if you accept the Bois report, you have to accept simultaneously that the legal system is a joke. This was 20 years ago. I guess people didn't know by then. Although it's not 100% lost, like let's not squander our remnant of a system that has process. And I was thinking of that just today. It's like I'm nostalgic for the good old days. I wish we could go back. I'm like, oh crap, someday these are going to be the good old days. So enjoy it while you can. And I'm not kidding. Not only can you have one set of litigated findings that are meaningless, but you can have 2 sets of litigated findings that are meaningless and a congressional investigation. While that's possible in theory, it's unlikely in practice. It's also alarming. And if the press had any brains, they should have said, wait just a minute. Because if that's true, we've got real problems. I'll tell you, that's true now. That is true now. And we have real problems. Nancy, the judges, of course, had sworn testimony from both sides in a court of law, whereas Bois talked only a few minutes to me and Bill. That was the end of the discussion, and no key justice people were put under oath. Question, was there not an offer made before the Bois report was issued to make a settlement? Bill, Bois will lie about it. You ought to ask him. Bois has denied that he made an offer, and he's a distinguished former judge who probably wouldn't lie. But Bois called Elliot Richardson and said to him, quote, have you given any thought to a global settlement figure? He did this in November or December of 1992 when Barr was still Attorney General. And Elliot Richardson explained to him that it's hard to come up with a global settlement when your own Justice Department won't candidly discuss the scope of what they have done. What is the scope of the damages? What is the relative magnitude of the damages? How many copies have you made of this software, and what else have you done with it? Question: what was the dollar figure at that point? Bill: he thought that Attorney General Barr would approve a settlement of $25 million quickly if he would make such a proposal. He also told 3 different reporters that he was considering recommending this in his report. The reporters were being used as trial balloons for us. In the same time frame, the fall of 92, he was considering recommending that the Department of Justice pay Inslaw $25 to $50 million. And when he mentioned $25 million to Elliot Richardson, one of the reporters, an investigative producer at CNN, said he means 50. So the whole impetus had to come from you? These were just suggestions that Bois was dropping? Elliot said that he was a little surprised that the criminal investigator is the civil negotiator. That was Bill. This is Nancy. We had given the evidence of broad malfeasance in the department, and to have the response be, how much do you want? We felt was inappropriate for someone who is supposedly an investigator. Bill: it's a farce. Questioner: that's Ken Thomas. Now Bois denies it all. Bill: he denied it to the press, and then Elliot offered to make available these detailed contemporaneous notes of the various conversations, and then he shut up. He didn't talk about it anymore. Ken Thomas: all that happened before the report was issued. Bill: that's right. Thomas: so the report comes out and that supposedly settles it, or was there an appeal after that? Bill: but it can't settle it. It's the Justice Department exonerating itself. Thomas: what I'm trying to determine is where Hubble tried to focus the investigation, the appeal. Nancy: appeal is the wrong word. This isn't a court. Bois is not a judge. He's a former judge hired by Barr using Justice Department lawyers. Bill: paid by Barr and reporting to Barr. That's not a judge. Nancy: but it gives the coloration of a judicial finding. Bill: but he is a lawyer for Attorney General Barr. He cannot put something down on paper. He can't do anything without his client, Bill Barr. So what happens is that the report is released by Reno in March. She appoints another person with the honorific title of judge. Judge Hubble will now review any problems that people have with the Bois report. So we submitted our rebuttal, and we met with them in October, and we acknowledged that there were 2 areas of problems with the Bois report. Not problems, but 2 pieces of unfinished business. Nancy: 2 that require further investigation, because our rebuttal made it pretty clear that this report was ludicrous on its face. Bill: and the 2 that he had acknowledged Bois hadn't done a good enough job on were Danny Casolaro and whether the FBI was using our software. So that's what he initially acknowledged that he would look into. Thomas: did he make a public statement of some sort? Bill: well, he told us. Nancy: we really don't want to go into what Hubble said to us. We don't think that we should. Thomas: the only reason I ask is that when they originally announced that they were going to reopen the original investigation, very few newspapers reported on it at all. Nancy: actually, reopening the investigation, they didn't. They said Bois had done a good job. And so the only 2 areas that they would look further at were the ones we mentioned. On those, they ended up siding with the Bois report also. Thomas: that Danny Casolaro committed suicide and that there was no malfeasance on the part of the FBI. Nancy: that the FBI software was not our software. Bill: you have to understand that this is like the former Justice Department lawyer who is on the front page of the New York Times and the Washington Post today, Michael Abel, who has just been indicted for obstruction of justice with regard to the Bolivian Cali cartel. It is no different than for that person to say, I was in the Justice Department for 17 years and I am issuing a report that finds me innocent. Thank you, Mr. Abel. The Justice Department is the defendant. The institution is the defendant. It is the same institution that is sitting in judgment on itself and contradicting the results of every single independent review of its conduct. In other words, the Bankruptcy Court, the U.S. District Court, the House Judiciary Committee, the Senate Permanent Investigations Subcommittee, all of those independent tribunals are wrong, and we're right about ourselves. We're blameless. So when you look at it that way, Thomas, but when you're talking about Hubble's investigation, Bill, Hubble is the Justice Department. Thomas, but it's a whole different set of personnel than those other investigations. Nancy, not really. Same career people. Thomas, one of the most alarming things about the whole business is Hubble's connection to Park on Meter and how Riconosciuto makes claims to be connected to Park on Meter. It's all such an inbred thing. The people that were involved in all of this in the first place do seem to be Republicans, Earl Bryan, Ed Meese, and Reagan. And here, a new administration, Democrats, different people, and they're all connected to it too. Bill, well, if you follow MENA, which I'm sure you have, good on you, Bill. They seem to have been a kind of partner to Reagan-Bush administration on some of these covert things. Thomas, did you see a lot of evidence for that connected to your problems? Did you know about Park on Meter? Nancy, we read about it, but you look at the Hubble Reno investigation, or handling of INSTALL, I should say, because it was no real investigation. When the Congress said, let's get it to an independent tribunal. Last fall, Charlie Rose introduced, last summer actually, that they would send the case to another independent tribunal. And while it was in committee, Reno rushed a letter to committee members to vote against it and summarizing their report, which they haven't even copied and made available. So intense was their effort to keep us out of court again. You have to ask, why are they so intense if there is nothing to it? What do they have to lose by having people look at this case again? Bill, there were two people we knew in the lobbying effort in the House of Representatives last fall to try to keep us from getting back to court, Edwin Meese and Janet Reno personally. Nancy, and so when it was reintroduced this spring by Senator Hatch, it passed by the unanimous consent of the Senate. Thomas, is it their point that the software that is being used now by Interpol, the Mossad, the FBI, and so on is not PROMIS? Bill, they do not acknowledge any of this. Thomas, I know one of the failures of the Bois report is that it didn't do a code comparison. I take it that the Hubble investigation didn't do one either? Bill, no. Nancy, we haven't been anywhere near the FBI software. Bill, the U.S. attorney's stuff, that's what the court case was about. That's all we knew about at the time. The U.S. attorney's office have never paid us for the software. So we used the subpoena power and got the software and compared it with our privately financed enhancements, the records of the department who paid for it and all that. And we proved at the time of the trial, we did not know that the software had been disseminated outside the U.S. attorney's office. We didn't find that out until subsequent years. First of all, Bois hired a professor at Georgetown University, the computer science department, the head of the department. She's the one who declined to compare the code and made a fatuous statement that PROMIS tracks judicial proceedings and the FBI system tracks investigations. So they couldn't possibly be the same software. Okay. Just a fatuous comment. That's a word I would have to kind of look up there. Don't run into too many of those these days. Our software, like the older you get, the less of the words you have to look up. Fatuous, I think it means like she knew it wasn't true, like a disingenuous, whatever. Our software tracks investigations at the state and local level all over the United States. It's just a stupid thing to say. Then Hubble hired a new professor from MIT, and they offered to have us attend his examination of the code. But they made it clear to us that we would not be permitted to look at the code. He would look at it. We told them that we were not interested in pretending to support another phony examination. If there was going to be any credibility, the people who developed the PROMIS code have to be able to see the FBI code. What are you afraid of in letting us look at it? We don't mind that you have your own experts there, but we want to see it. We don't, frankly, trust the government, and we wouldn't believe anything the Justice Department said under any administration. Thomas, did they respond to that at all? Bill, they said, no, you can't look at it. So then they had their MIT professor say it's not the same code, and who knows what he looked at. Thomas, are you familiar with this company in Little Rock, Arkansas called Systematics, Inc.? Bill, yes. Thomas, the story there is that somehow PROMIS has been applied to the banking industry. Do you know anything about that? Bill, we are fairly confident that it was installed in the World Bank in 1983 and the IMF. So this is all backdoor surveillance stuff that the World Bank has into financial transactions and the IMF in 1983. And they think it was used to do all that insider trading and stuff before 9/11? It sounds like it. Dana Casolaro introduced us to two former computer employees at the World Bank who told us all of this. There have been published articles in the International Banking Regulator newsletter that independently verified it. So if you put it in the World Bank and the IMF, it's not likely that you've just put it there. Any effort to take software as flexible as this is, you have to really think through how you're going to use it in a different application area and think about how you're going to use it in banking and then just put it in one bank. That doesn't make sense. So the hardest evidence we have has to do with the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, but logic supports the idea that it is much more widely used. I mean, this is huge. This guy should be one of the like tech billionaires because it's probably the backbone of so much. It's like the fruit of the poisonous tree in law. It's probably spawned so much, but that's been built upon it and not even reinvented along the way. All right. Anyway, it's here. Okay. A little more, 2 more pages. You hear a lot of things about the way promise had been applied. There has even been a report that one of its earliest uses was to extrapolate Soviet sub-launches out of the Arctic ice. Bill says, I haven't heard that one. Thomas, you haven't? Bill, there was supposedly an application by the military that it was out on loan from the Justice Department. Nancy, the software would not launch things. Thomas, no, the story is that it had the ability to track. Nancy, it does have that ability. It can track anything. Thomas, they apparently had a very difficult time prior to using whatever it was they used, tracking submarines through the Arctic ice. The Soviets would just go in there and they would lose track of them. This is what I'm saying. This is probably the backbone of so much. I mean, up there with like, McAfee, which you see everywhere. Maybe more so. I mean, that has like one application. Bill, we are fairly confident that they use Promise on the nuclear submarines to track other submarines. They call it Promise. Capital PROMIS, all caps. Nancy, it doesn't do the tracking. You give it the information to make it keep track of your information. It has no capacity to do the tracking itself. I love that Nancy knows what she's doing. You know, I don't normally like girl power, but when it's like 100% irrefutably real and super based, I'm into it. Although these people were working for the government, but what they were doing was police databases for perpetrators, and to the extent that they're talking about real criminals, I'm fine with it. I'm totally against real crime. And if we're going to have a government, I would say that's the only legitimate function of it. It's just keeping track of the tracking transactions, where you last saw it, when the last sighting. Okay, so he's saying you get your blip and it collates it, I guess I would say. Thomas, it doesn't extrapolate? That's the rumor. Why Promise is so attractive to people. It is that it has great predictive capabilities. Hey, baby, maybe Rakana Shudo did that. Bill says, not really. Nancy says, it depends on how you use the information you have. It organizes it for you, and it's valuable that way, but it's up to the human being using it to go from there. Thomas, now you have 2 brothers in St. Louis, right? And one of them was the secretary to the police board in the early 70s. Bill, I don't know what years anymore. He was secretary of the police board once. Thomas, he was there at a time when they implemented something called Regis, REGIS, all caps. Is that connected to Promise? Bill, no, he created Regis. Thomas, a different kind of software altogether? Nancy, Regis isn't software, it's an organization. Bill, Regional Justice Information System. Thomas, so you say you have never seen what the FBI uses? Have you seen a demonstration of the software of any of the groups that supposedly have Promise, like the Mossad or the Mounties or whatever? Bill, oh, no, they won't let us. Nancy, we'd love to see a demonstration. Although the demonstration isn't, Bill, you have to look at the code. Nancy, that's what was wrong with the professor at Georgetown saying, I just look at the screen and I don't need to see any more. That's ludicrous. I mean, nowadays we all know that's ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. Thomas, so do you still own Promise or does the Justice Department? Bill, Why would the Justice Department own it? Because they stole it? You think that's how it works? If I steal your glasses, they're mine? Thomas, of course, you're right. He's getting pissed. Nancy, if you make a copy of the Lotus software, you don't own the software. You just have a copy. Thomas, so you still make Promise available to your clients? Bill, we sell it. Nancy, we don't give it away, and the software is always changing. That's what we're about here, is developing new software, adding to it, creating new enhancements to it, keeping up with the times. That's interesting because once there was that fork and like Shudo and those guys were making changes to the Justice Department one, you would see the differences. And I wonder if they reincorporate any of the new Promise stuff. I mean, then you've also got the whole copyright idea where if you have the code, it's yours, that you don't have a right to have the government police your information. However, then you would encrypt it or whatever it would take to let people use it without actually having access to the code. So there's reliance on those kind of laws and on the contract that Justice Department said they would pay you. Thomas, does it have a version like Promise 1.7? Nancy, you can call it that, but it doesn't matter. Thomas, who are your clients? If the Justice Department supplies everyone, Bill, we don't sell it to intelligence agencies and we don't sell it to the World Bank or the IMF. We sell it to state and local courts and prosecutors. We sell to big corporations, but we don't sell to U.S. and foreign intelligence agencies. Nancy, you may be thinking of a smaller program. It's 500,000 lines of code approximately, so it's not something you easily copy and disseminate. It's a complicated, sophisticated system. Thomas, are you familiar at all with Casolaro's investigation of Hughes aircraft? That's one of the theories, that investigating INSTALL and the Octopus, he just kind of brushed up against manufacturing fraud involving Hughes aircraft, and that led to his death. Nancy, what he brushed up against was someone who was interested in Hughes aircraft, who used to work for it, Bill Turner. As you may know, Bill Turner is one of my favorite artists, and he's from Atlanta, but it's probably a different guy. I think it's BillTurner.net. As you may know, when a reporter works on a story, or even for INSTALL having a story, everybody and his brother who has some kind of problem think maybe they can handle my problem. So Bill Turner went to Danny, hoping to get Danny interested in Bill Turner's problem at Hughes Aircraft, and that's how he got into that. Thomas, you have no reason to believe there was more to it than that? Nancy, what do you mean by more than that? That's how he came into Hughes Aircraft. He met with Turner the night before he died, and Turner had given him, according to Turner, a stack of documents. Bill, I don't think there is anything particular to Hughes Aircraft. That all may be true or not true. I don't know. But in setting out to investigate the Justice Department's theft of Promise, this is the point Nancy made, he ended up picking up stones and finding stuff about BCCI, about the October surprise, sales of high technology to Iraq, to Saddam Hussein before the war, and about Iran-Contra. And I think that reason he did that is some of the same people are involved with all these things, making money. They don't say, let's do something bad, let's make some money. That's what Danny told me this whole thing was about. People set out to make money by selling drugs, weapons, stolen software. Nancy, I think that when he died, a lot of the headlines and news shows said, quote, reporter investigating BCCI, because BCCI had just broken onto the scene. That meant something to someone. But what we've told you is actually what happened. Thomas, so you are convinced that he was murdered. Bill, we think that there has never been an honest investigation of what happened to him, and that there are all of the indications that we are aware of strongly suggest that he was murdered. But we're not saying that, okay? There, except that he was murdered. We're saying get out of the way and let an independent investigation by an independent counsel, Nancy, who doesn't have any interest, Bill, who doesn't have anything to hide, do an investigation. Let it take place. Nancy, there's too many questions about his death for any reasonable person to say, yes, this was suicide. And there's a lot of misinformation out there that worry about his finances. We didn't see it. He was not a guy who gave a damn about finances. We know other things, that his family had money, offered him money. Bill, friends offered him money. He didn't kill himself for that. Thomas, so do you believe it was because of his investigation of the INSTALL case? Or do you think that with all these things, it could have been anything? Therefore, let's find out. Nancy, we can't know. If we knew, we wouldn't be wondering. But he certainly was into a lot of things during his investigation. BCCI is a major, major scandal. Bill, and it looks increasingly convincing to us that the promised software was installed throughout the BCCI empire to keep track of wire transfers of money and letters of credit so that NSA could monitor. I believe that the promised software was used in all kinds of things. There are two things knitting all this together. One is that the same people are making money in all these different kinds of businesses. And the other thing that is, in many instances, promise was the useful way of keeping track of everything that was happening. This is amazing. That's the end of that interview. But that this software, which gave these people, they were omniscient. Yes, they knew all. They knew all about terrorists, yes, maybe, about movement, about money, about the money movements. Do you know how much money you can make if you have foreknowledge? It's infinite. That's what I think happened with George Soros. It's infinite, practically speaking. If you know that LIBOR scandal, just a tiny little tweak in the interest rates, little teeny movements can result in billions, probably trillions of dollars. So the fact that they were using it everywhere, of course. I mean, what fucking guys. And the thing is, these are the people who are supposed to be protecting us. These are the law. It's a mob. It's crazy. Anyway, if you are interested, that's the end of it. That's the end of this book. But if you're interested in the sources, here the next appendix 2 is just it's just page after page of his newspaper clippings of Casolaro. So this isn't his accordion file, but it sure is a lot of information in the public domain that he used to pull together his story, his investigation. Look at it all. I guess that's why in the Netflix documentary, they said, yeah, there's a book, but it's all just lists of sources. Well, it's not, because we just read 170 something pages of not just sources, but there's a lot of sources in there. There is another appendix. Let's see. 2, 4, 6, 8. 8 pages. It's an interview with Michael Riconosciuto, the Maury Island connection. Should we read it? It seems to be completely unrelated. I don't know. If you don't want to listen, you don't have to listen. I'll go ahead and read it because just, why not? That Michael Riconosciuto is a hoot. I have to have a sip of water. All right, let's whip through this. This is Appendix 3. Michael Riconosciuto's link to the Kennedy assassination figure Fred Chrisman. Or is it Chrisman? Chrisman? Anyone? See, frightening me. I said goodbye too soon. He says, thanks, Monica. The series was great. Okay, let me just whip through this one. It says Michael Riconosciuto's link to Kennedy assassination figure Fred Chrisman remains one of his most interesting. Its details are examined in the book Maury Island UFO by Illuminate Press, a prequel to The Octopus, for which the following interview was conducted. Do you remember Fred Chrisman or John Gold? What can you tell me about him? Are you familiar with his memoir, Murder in the City? Answer. This is Michael Riconosciuto. Murder in the City really wasn't a memoir for Fred Chrisman. Murder in the City was about a political episode in Tacoma that Fred Chrisman played a role in. But it was written by him, right? He's the author of it, yes. He had a talk show there, and there was a big, heated political battle in Tacoma. My father was on one side, and Dave Rollins was on the other side. These are two guys that grew up together and were rivals. Who's the other one? Dave Rollins. This is what's mapped out in John Gold's, a.k.a. Fred Chrisman's book. Yes, I had known Fred ever since I was a small boy, probably about 8 years old, and I traveled all over the world with him. I probably made 20 trips abroad with him. One of the gray areas with Chrisman for me is what role he played in the Maury Island UFO thing. The Maury Island UFO was an event that he created. He created it out of whole cloth? I have almost 1,600 pages of handwritten notes by Fred Chrisman. Oh, yeah? Uh-huh. An unpublished manuscript? Yes. That's a new one. Fred was working with Mary C. Johnson at Boeing. What is the name again? Mary C. Johnson. Mary Katrina Johnson in security at Boeing, and they had done some tests or something. This is late 1940s? Yes, and there was a public outcry over it. Too much public scrutiny into what was going on. So Fred came up with this cover story. The cover story was intended to cover up what was happening at Boeing? Yes. Which was what? Some sort of test. Test? Some sort of aircraft. Aircraft tests at Boeing? Yes. And what happened was that something had gone wrong and some debris had fallen over Maury Island and they had to get the stuff back. Fred did, in fact, get the stuff back. That is my understanding just from reading the books on the thing, that he held on to it. There is no indication that he turned over everything he had to those 2 investigators who died. Now, the 2 investigators who died were basically in on it. They were out to investigate the security screw-ups at Boeing and the procedures for running their test program. I see. So you're saying this was a test on an advanced but conventional aircraft that went awry. This is what fell on Harold Dahl, and Chrisman wasn't actually part of the actual incident, right? He comes in later? He comes in later, yes. But the problem is that a dog that belonged to Harold Dahl died of radiation sickness. Oh, really? Yes, and there was something. Dahl's son was also injured. Yes, there was something radioactive on board. It was a big scandal, a big problem. When these Air Force guys died, Fred was absolutely bent out of shape, and he related that to me. All of this is in the manuscript that you talked about? Yes, and personally, he told me what went on behind it. Do you know anything more about that slag that fell on them? Do you know what it was? No, other than that there was a reactor of some sort on board this aircraft. It was an advanced radar platform of some sort, and Mary C. Johnson has corroborated the story many years later, like in 1982 and 1983 and 1984. I spent a lot of time with Mary C. Johnson. Does she still work for Boeing? Oh, no, she's deceased. She was up there in years. When you say she corroborated it, you mean corroborated it to you? She didn't talk to the press or anything like that. Oh, no, she wouldn't have any reason to. She was a career type person, and she was a kind of mentor to our little group in Seattle. She and Arlen Bell's widow were on the board of directors of one of our companies. I had bought her home out in Lake Bay, Washington. She used to come out and visit us all the time. I spent a lot of time with her. Okay, so at the time, Chrisman was working for what? Military intelligence or something of that sort? He was a point man on cleaning up a mess, and it was just a fluke that those Air Force guys died in that plane crash. So as far as you understand Kenneth Arnold's role, for instance, and Ray Palmer's role in this, is that Chrisman helps to inject into the media that this was some kind of UFO event, and Palmer kind of glommed onto that. He has no direct role in the cover-up, right? Chrisman was a master at emotional contagion, an absolute master at it. In the OSS, over occupied territories in Europe, where they were doing nuclear research, Chrisman had to deal with some guys out in the Army Air Corps, and they were dropping these do-nothing sophisticated gizwidgets that were in bombs. The Germans couldn't ignore them. They looked like high-tech surveillance devices, you know? How large were they? Oh, probably 12 to 15 pounds each, and there would be several of them in a good-sized aerial bomb. The German high command's attitude was that they were sophisticated somethings and they were being dropped in their most sensitive areas. The German scientists kept telling them, no, 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 nothing. And it was one of the story has been documented in a book, but I can't remember the name of it. It was a great brain drain on their nuclear program. That is so fascinating. So they dropped this puzzle to nowhere on the nuclear the nuclear scientists in Germany just to get them to try to figure something out instead of making progress on their nuclear program. I mean, that obviously really gives some information on how, I mean, I'm telling you, I used to have Twitter people like just suck me into hour-long arguments. And I was like, I think they're there just to waste my time. I never fell for it again, but I feel like my suspicions are confirmed. Fred gave me some astronomical figure on how many man years it took away from the scientific effort of their nuclear program at a critical time. Wow. And I've said that before. They need to give you puzzles. They are so good at the psych stuff. I mean, I hate them, but you gotta respect what they're doing, except for that they're using our money and our trust to deceive us, and I am not a fan of deceit. Fred got these scientists from Princeton and the University of Chicago, and he got some real eggheads to come up with the scam that he ran on them. Fred was a master of this kind of thing. We're still talking about late 1940s here, right? Right. In Indochina. Fred had a history of doing that stuff. These widgets that you're talking about were just totally fake little things that they attached to drop bombs. Well, they actually did have some substance, enough so that they couldn't be ignored. I'm just fascinated by this as a complete prototype of what they're doing in the information sphere. Sphere. I have a news article from July 11th, 1947, talking about Guy Bannister, then working as a SAC, a special agent in charge for the FBI in Butte, recovering what is reported as a flying disc that's 30.5 inches in diameter. I wonder if there's a connection there. In post-World War II, they had a development phase with this radioactive discs to cloud the film of aerial surveillance platforms. They used different schemes, and they had a lot of trouble recovering them. They had a lot of screw-ups. So these things had a function then. Yes, and extreme radiation will destroy most films, especially in sensitive aerial photography. Now, Fred was very, very close to George Wackenhut. I don't know if that's been established before. Oh, yeah, absolutely. I've known of it since 1963, maybe the first time I ever saw them together. Do you know who Chuck Emmert is? I haven't heard the name, no. Okay, his mother was a wealthy Florida socialite who financed George Wackenhut when he originally started Wackenhut. Is that a name I could do a LexisNexis search on? I doubt it. He managed to stay pretty buried, although his mother, I can't remember her first name, but she was big in Southern Florida. With anybody in social circles down there, would be able to steer you to her. Did Chrisman ever talk about the Kennedy assassination with you? Yes, he did. What about this idea that some people have that he was one of the three hobos in the rail yard behind Dealey Plaza? Well, I don't know about that. He gave me his version of what happened. He did give it to you. Oh, yeah. A mutual friend of ours was a former Treasury Department agent who, during the Warren Commission, was one of the investigators for the committee. Do you want to name him? His name is Bob. I don't know where he is now. I lost track of him about 10 years ago. Bob. The only Bob I know from the Octopus book was Bob Nichols. Do you not want to give a last name? I really don't. I think he just wants he was very, very ill at the time, the last time I saw him. Okay, so it's not Bob Nichols. He was working for us. I was with both he and Fred when Fred found out that he had turned over information to Garrison. Fred turned over information? No, Bob. Bob turned over information to Garrison? Right. What I found astounding was that when Bob was working on the Warren Commission, what the hell was that? Why didn't he turn that over to the Warren Commission? And one day I asked him and he said he did. They knew everything. Now, when you say that stuff, what exactly are you referring to here? Chrisman's story of his role in the assassination? Right. What had gone on? Is it possible for you to summarize that briefly? Or is that in the 600-page manuscript you were talking about? Here's something that happens. Everybody says, hey, how come you know about everything? Every conspiracy that's ever gone down the pike. It kind of seems like that. If something happens, hey, Reconasciuto's got something to say about it. Well, I can't help it that I was raised around Fred Chrisman. I mean, I can't help that cosmic act of fate in my life. I understand what you're saying, and things really are connected. People have trouble accepting that fact at all, that there are connections to be made. I get treated like I'm delusional. So I find that around certain things, the less I say, the better off I am, because most people are not going to take the time to go check it out. Very few people even know who Fred Chrisman is or what kind of player he was. I tried to tell some reporters from the Village Voice I knew Fred Chrisman. They refused to believe me. There was a thing written about it. Yeah, sure. Show us the book. How can I show you a book when I'm in a jail cell? I have a friend who was a SAC the day that happened. The day of the Kennedy assassination? Yeah. I'll tell you what, I got it more than just from Fred. I'm still curious about exactly what Fred Chrisman told you. Is it possible to summarize it? I really don't want to go into that. Calls are taped here. Fred left a momentous. What about the manuscript? He had it squirreled away, and as far as I know, it's safe. The party that has it is very reliable. At this point in time, it is irrelevant to me getting out of prison. The things that concern me are the things connected to this case. I was just fascinated by the fact that Chrisman came up. It seems that Contact magazine found out that Chrisman knew my father, and then they found out that he actually knew me, and they just went wild. They made a big deal out of it. Which magazine? Contact and UFO magazine. This Colin Brown was hanging around Ted Gunderson. Ted Gunderson was also hanging around with Maury Terry in the later stages of the Son of Sam investigations. We can talk about Ted Gunderson another time. I'll have to. I wonder if people believe he's the real deal or not. Brown was the guy that worked for Technical Consultant magazine. I think so. And you did an interview with him? Not really. I talked to him on the phone a couple of times, and I wanted some help on my case. I don't want to talk about weirdness. I was research director at Wackenhut, and at the time I was there, we took over Area 51 in Nevada, and we also had the Nevada test site, and he was pumping me for all kinds of stuff out of there, and I just told him, hey, I don't want to get into that. I got enough problems right now. I'm facing life in prison on drug charges, and it all stems from the Cabazon Wackenhut joint venture, and I just don't need to get into that stuff. Did Danny Casolaro pump you for information about that? Yeah, Danny found out a lot of stuff. In fact, Danny had a lot of information on that, and I'm surprised you didn't get it. The papers that were collected after he died originally went to ABC's Nightline. By the time they got to me, they had been picked over pretty cleanly. But there are notes in there about Area 51. Some, not a lot. That whole subject matter with Wackenhut is one that I would want to steer clear of. Again, there's an aura of being delusional, and I'm concerned about credibility here. And the fact of the matter is that Wackenhut is the only company that has ever had the security contract for any of these places, even though they are supposed to go up for open bid. And this is the way it's been since the early 50s when these various agencies and these various places were set up. Wackenhut was steered right in, and I happen to have been born into a situation by virtue of my father's contacts, my maternal grandfather's contacts. I was just around. Not to mention, right, Kaneshudo was some kind of super genius, which is probably why he's so weird. Okay. You appear in that book, Murder of a City, as wiring your father's office. Well, no, we ran a cable TV company. So your cable guy might have been a super genius. I'm currently trying to track this article that is a photograph of you, and it talks about a child prodigy, a child genius working with various kinds of sound equipment. It's really this glowing piece about what a genius you are working with sound. I was doing commercial sound as a teenager. I made a lot of money as a teenager doing commercial sound. I was involved with various rock and roll groups during what is known as the instrumental sound era. Most of these groups hit the charts: the Viceroys, the Ventures, the Wailers, Paul Revere, and the Raiders. I don't know if you're familiar with any of these groups. The Wailers? I think we're familiar. The Paul Revere, yeah. Mm-hmm. Sure. Who wouldn't be familiar with the Ventures? Oh, I don't know about that. The guitar groups are what you're talking about. Yeah, the instrumental sound. And you worked with them? You bet. Like producing albums and so forth? Kearney Barton and myself. You did the sound at the gigs or you produced albums? The whole bit. Back then we had Ampex 3-track recorders. That was the state of the art at the time. I was doing special effects and things like that. I was pretty involved and I made a lot of money. So as a teenager, you were working as an entrepreneur? Right. I was building sound systems, building these new huge 300-watt tube amplifiers, transmitting tubes, sound reinforcement systems, PA systems. And this was at the time that your father was involved with Chrisman? He knew Chrisman ever since I was in high school. Ever since he was in high school. He has his own business going. Advertising, public relations. My father worked on Kennedy's campaign staff when he got elected, and he got Governor Al Rossellini elected up in the state of Washington. He was the point man for former Senator Warren Magnuson, Scoop Jackson. He was one of Scoop's top advisors. So this thing with Fred Chrisman is kind of an aside here. All right. Now we're finished. Should we do a few comments? Let us see. Hello. Yes, frightening me. Echelon was recording phone calls and tracking keywords. Al-Qaeda means base as in database. It was the CIA term. Right, I was wondering who Michael Ruppert is. Thank you, frightening me. He was an LA detective turned whistleblower on the agency, bringing cocaine into the city. That was the Gary Webb thing. That was Freeway Ricky Ross. And he too committed suicide, you're saying? Just like Gary Webb. Frightening me. Frightening me points out that the strategy of tension is Operation Gladio, where the supposed good guys killed people and blamed it on communists in Italy so that they would vote communist light, whatever, social democrat. Governmental side, Clint calls it. Frightening me says Webster Hubble is Chelsea's real dad. They look alike, but also Bill. I don't know. Okay, Cat Duckness says fatuous is similar to telling you that you're quibbling with semantics. That's not exactly the exact definition, but it's close. Okay, thank you. The government is real crime. Oh, wow. What an idea, Frightening Me says. Was promised the CIA database that referred to Al Qaeda. Maybe. Cat Duckness wants to know what I'm reading next. And behind this screen is probably 1,000 of my like 2,000 books. And there are 2 similar books by Jim Keith about mind control, maybe 3. And there's one I remember was the best one. So I'm going to read that. I think it's like maybe called MK Ultra. I'm starting that immediately next week. Cat Duckness thinks Riconosciuto is a piece of work, a king of invasion and redirection. I think you're talking about Riconosciuto, must be, because it's just you just made the comment. All right, my people, thank you so much for coming, and I'm really looking forward to the next one. I'm so glad people like this. Remember, there's a full playlist on YouTube of that, and I'm going to put in the description the local coverage of the Dave McGowan case. I'll do that right now. All righty, thank you, folks.